right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our seminar today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you all. And I think Amanda Milstein has the profile that is perfectly fitting for our session today, Climate Health Now. My name is Laura Bothwell. I'm with the Yale Center for Climate Change and Health with the Global Initiative on Climate Change and Public Health Ethics. And today we are just thrilled to be featuring Dr. Oscar Berglund. He's a lecturer in international public and social policy at the University of Bristol, where he's joining us from today. He's a critical political economist researching climate activism. He explores why, how, and to what effect activists use disruptive forms of protest. He also researches different converging and clashing visions in the climate movement of how societies, economies, and political systems may need to change. Dr. Berglund is the author of Extinction, Rebellion, and Climate Change Activism, and contributes to debates about climate activism across various academic disciplines, in international media, and with activist groups. So we're so grateful for him to take the time to speak with us today. The seminar itself will be approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll have an option at the end for a conversation of Q&A. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Berglund.
Thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be speaking to Yale. You know, it's a big deal. Yeah, I'm not that I haven't spoken to American audiences that many times, so it's great to do that. So yeah, I'll just crack on. So basically, I didn't know exactly what kind of composition of audience I was expecting here today. So I'm kind of presume that it's largely academic, but not necessarily the kind of political theory stuff that often ask these questions about, you know, I was asked to address kind of the ethics of civil disobedience, and I chose to put it as, you know, should we break the law to save the world, which is partly an ethical question, but it's also, you know, one of politics and strategy, and when it's wise to do so. So I might get onto those questions a little bit later on, and that might be more interesting for those who are on the more activist side, which I did see some Extinction Rebellion signs and so on in the amongst you. But if we first sort of address the question of you know, ethics, then you can see the most kind of stringent version of literature that looks at whether we should break the law, when it's okay to break the law as part of protest, comes from John Rawls. And John Rawls really wrote, you know, in the early 70s, late 60s about this, and he was part of a set of literature that grew around the US civil rights movement that was kind of there to justify that movement, but in a way that would kind of make it, I suppose, appeal to a broader audience, and try to figure out when is it okay to break the law as part of protest. And he wasn't obviously the first person to write about civil disobedience, but he certainly has been the most important one, and the one that has lasted. You know, it's almost anybody who works on civil disobedience has to relate themselves to Rawls in one way or another. Obviously, a lot of you work on ethics, so you will no doubt be familiar with Rawls's other writings. But about civil disobedience, I mean, he defines it as a public, non-violent, conscientious yet political act contrary to law, but usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. So, as such, it is in a very kind of liberal framing. Obviously, you know, Rawls is a liberal theorist. And it is quite, you know, reformist in that sense. And, you know, famously, the whole theory of justice is written about nearly perfect, I can't remember the vocabulary he uses, but, you know, a nearly just democratic society. And a lot of what he's saying is about, you know, framing civil disobedience as something that is legitimate to do, and maintaining that legitimacy is what his kind of theorizing is all about. And I think there's two aspects particularly that are really important in rules, and that are really important to see how that movements today always have to kind of relate to. And those are the last resort and fidelity to law. And it is to show that if you're going to break the law, if you're going to annoy people, if you're going to sit in a road, if you're going to do, even slightly less non-violent, if you're going to, break windows or do something that is outside of the law, that's going to annoy people or people who own property, then you need to show that doing so is a last resort. That you've exhausted, and he defines it as exhausting other means of doing what we want. But I think for the climate change question, this last resort takes on another meaning, right? Like, we know that this is, time is running out, and we're heading in the wrong direction. Emissions are not decreasing; they are increasing, and we know that that we're up against time in saving what we can save. So in that sense, the discourses of a lot of these movements that practice civil disobedience for action against climate change obviously draw very heavily on this kind of last resort that it is, and credibly so. I think that it's very difficult. Well, it's difficult to contradict people who say that it is a last resort. And then you have the fidelity to law. So he says that not only does it need to be last resort, but we need to practice civil disobedience within an overall fidelity to law. And that's what really sort of emphasize the kind of liberal aspects of this, as it's reformist, it's within the state, it's within the system as it is. It's not something that it tries to revolutionize the system. So the obligations that then get put on to the practitioners of civil disobedience is that it needs to be done in the open, it needs to be done in a kind of conscientious way. You cannot be masked when you do it, and you need to accept the legal consequences of what you do. And I think that's very much along the lines of the kind of disobedience that Extinction Rebellion started practicing in the UK, and also that the groups that have come out of Extinction Rebellion and so Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain and all the other groups around Europe, particularly that have emerged in different countries right now, do practice it in that kind of open and conscientious way. But that fidelity to law, that kind of arrest focus, and this imagery of being carried away and facing cause of the law, also means a kind of sacrifice, and that's has been important for legitimacy, right? So because the people that are involved in these movements seldom are the ones that are hardest hit by climate change in here and now, right? We know the membership of these groups tend to be quite well educated, tend to be quite white, and tends to be quite middle class. So are not at the brunt of climate change in the here and now. Therefore, because they are not the ones that are worst affected by the problem, they kind of need to show a level of sacrifice in order to be listened to, in order to be kind of legitimate voices in this. Now, then, if that was what kind of, if fidelity to law and last resort was kind of the Rawlsian one, I understand that was a very stringent view of when it's okay to use civil disobedience, then the kind of political theory literature about civil disobedience has moved a long way since then. And this is one, the pictured book is a recent edited book that takes up a lot of different aspects here, where all the kind of a lot of the current big writers about civil disobedience in general have written chapters. So what some of the points that they raise kind of against rules is that, well, we don't live in a nearly just society. So a lot of what rule says can't really be taken, his kind of quite limited perspective of when it's okay to break the law can't really be taken that seriously, or we can't be limited by that because we don't live in the nearly just society that rules presumes. So instead, a lot of these authors ask about, well, what are our political obligations to whom? And, obviously with that, they don't accept a kind of limited view of, that you have to follow the law, right? But ask, under what circumstances do we need to follow the law? And, who do we owe political obligations to? And when you look at the way that, for example, Extinction Rebellion frame this, they frame it around kind of having a social contract that has been broken by the states and so on. And then you can ask, did we ever have a kind of, social contract is also quite a, liberal kind of theory. So was there ever a social contract? And if so, has it been broken? But that kind of language of social contract is one that obviously Extinction Rebellion particularly uses quite a lot. And one aspect from this literature also that comes up is, does disobedience have to be civil? So, what do we mean by civil? Well, civil tends to mean non-violent, and then, where do we draw the line of what's violent and non-violent? There's others. For example, throwing soup at a Van Gogh painting would presumably not, it's not necessarily violent, but would probably be seen as non-civil, as in, it's not just about displaying your things, you kind of like, you're after the kind of shock element if you do that, which would probably be seen as uncivil by many. So, like, under what circumstances do you have to keep to those kind of rules of civility? Now, the other kind of set of political theory literature that looks at the ethics, particularly of civil disobedience, is anarchist literature. And I mean, since I started studying these things, I have become much more of an anarchist myself. I'm not an anarchist, but I've learned much more about anarchism and the kind of values and so on that they propose, and it's actually quite an interesting literature to get into. It's obviously something that is very far out there in terms of most academic literature, but it is definitely worthwhile when you ask questions about should we break the law to save the world. Anarchism certainly has a lot to say about it. And what anarchists literature says is that, well, what they don't talk about civil disobedience, they talk about direct action. And direct action doesn't necessarily have to be illegal, and it doesn't necessarily have to be non-violent either. But what it should be always is prefigurative. So what does that mean? Well, that means prefigurative is kind of when you try to, it's when the means and the ends are congruent. So you should be trying to create the future that you want on a smaller scale here and now. So these kind of figurative values were very strong, for example, in the Occupy movement. And it's about, how do we relate to each other? How do we make decisions? And that should be in a way that is in the kind of society that we would like in the future. And I don't know if any of you have been watching The Last of Us, for example, lately on TV. It's a big deal here, but what I would see is the kind of semi-anarchist socialist community that they have in a kind of one of the apocalyptic scenarios there would certainly be a kind of prefigurative way of organizing society. What it means in terms of civil disobedience is then that what you do should not be just symbolic. So throwing soup at a Van Gogh painting would not be particularly prefigurative. There is nothing that links the action of wanting drastic action on climate change and having a painting that is a few hundred years old covered by soup, right? So there's nothing. So there's no congruency there between the means and the ends, nor necessarily is public disruption of the kind that, you sit on a road somewhere. If you close off, you try to make a car-free city center or so on, then you can argue that maybe that's a little bit more prefigurative, because you're kind of trying to create a society without cars. But probably sitting on a motorway is not that prefigurative. So it should go beyond the symbolic, and it should not be consequentialist. And you can argue that that's kind of when you sit on a motorway, and well, when you are disrupting the public, you are doing so in order to get their attention, but it's not really the public that is your target. You're trying to do it for kind of to get media attention or other kinds of attention, but you're doing it because you have this other gripe, this other thing, which is, let's stop climate change. But that's then, because there is no connection between what you want and what you do, that becomes a kind of consequentialist act as well. You're causing harm to some people because you have this other bigger, more important thing that you want to claim. But so that would not be according to a kind of anarchist ethics, which ought to be prefigurative. Now, what would be prefigurative then? Well, it would be prefigurative to stop, block oil refineries, for example, which is also something that the climate movement have done. It would be prefigurative to block airports, particularly these like airports that are used by private jets and so on, right, which is also a practice that some of these movements have done. So those kind of actions that are more targeted, well, they target things that are simply incompatible with a sustainable, an ecologically sustainable world. So those kind of actions would be prefigurative in a different way. So those are kind of the different kind of ethical, reasons why, ethics to follow. Then, when we get into the more political, we can ask, why should we disobey the law? So why is breaking the law to save the world even something that is worth considering politically? So then what it achieves, and what obviously the most kind of famous examples of this in recent year achieve, is media attention, right? It gets media attention to an issue or to a group. And then you must always ask, to what purpose do you do that? To what purpose do you get that media attention? And what some of these later groups then have realized is that, okay, well, if we have a name that gets mentioned every time in the media, like Insulate Britain, or like Just Stop Oil, less so maybe with Just Stop Oil, but still, as various groups around Europe as well do, then every time you get mentioned in the media, it kind of is obvious. You can politicize an issue, you can raise the profile of a certain issue in a way that, for example, Extinction Rebellion didn't necessarily do, although they did certainly in Britain when they first kind of became famous in April 2019 with the occupation of central London. They did achieve a lot of attention towards climate change, and they did change public opinion quite drastically on climate change, and that has lasted. So that kind of media attention can obviously serve a purpose. It doesn't necessarily serve a purpose, so it's important that that all the talk isn't about the action, that you get to talk about the issue, and the responsibility to do that doesn't just lie with the movement themselves. It lies with people like me and other experts who get to talk in the media as a result of the actions that people do. So when I get interviewed about things, about Van Gogh paintings and so on, it's important that I bring the conversation back to what it should be about, which is, in the case of that, Just Stopping Oil, which is about which is about renewing this, or like giving new oil licenses, 100 new licenses to explore oil and gas in the UK. So that kind of, using that media attention is obviously important. It's not obvious that the media attention is a good thing. It's also exaggerated, those that say that it's a bad thing. It's like, and this is something that I'm actually starting to do quite a lot of research into now, really trying to see the public opinion effects of unpopular protests, which if you look at opinion polls are actually, there's really very little evidence to say that unpopular protests are counterproductive for the movement as a whole. It's people don't really stop. People don't think that we should burn the planet because they get annoyed of people sitting in the road. That there's little evidence to suggest that, although there is one group in society, it seems, that gets a little bit more militantly against it. But largely that's not what happens. But that doesn't mean that all attention is good attention. Like, you need to know what you want to do with the attention that you get from the media. So you can ask that for what purpose? And then a deeper question there is, well, what is the role of public opinion? Are you trying to recruit people to the movement? Are you trying to just let people know that climate change is real and it's a threat and that it gets talked about? And if it is the latter, then in the UK and in most of Europe, that has already been kind of achieved. Like, climate change denialism is a very small phenomenon. People on the large know that climate change is real and know that it's a threat. How big a threat it is, they might not, if you ask the general public, you probably don't get as accurate answers. But getting climate change just talked about isn't necessarily the win that it maybe was 10 or 20 years ago, not in the UK or in Europe. I don't want to speak on behalf of the US, because I know that obviously in the US, climate change denialism has been a much bigger problem. And you have certainly powerful political forces that deny climate change in a way in the US that we don't necessarily have on this side of the Atlantic. But anyway, it's not obvious that what you want public opinion about, like, is important. Just simply getting the attention isn't necessarily going to achieve very much. So another reason that these movements use disobedience and break the law is to create a kind of tension and polarization in society, so that issues can get sort of politicized. So that you're going to anger a lot of people, but you try to use that anger to kind of politicize the issues that you want to get politicized. And that polarization has been largely successful. So you now see in opinion polls that, like, people who are concerned about climate change are much more likely to be supportive of groups that do this. What you haven't seen is loads of people joining civil disobedience movements, right? So these movements are still made up by really quite a small section of society. So although you have about 10% of people saying that, oh, I would do civil disobedience for climate change, the actual number that are involved is obviously much smaller. One of the key reasons why to engage in direct action or civil disobedience is that it can get direct results. Now, the chance of getting direct results is much greater if your target is closer to home. So obviously, if your demand is to, save the world, and then no actor that you're protesting against is going to be able to do that. If your target is to even stop the government doing something, then it's going to be difficult to do that. Whereas if your target is to stop your university investing in oil and gas, for example, that's a much more achievable target to actually get results if you do civil disobedience. And indeed, we have seen such civil disobedience work in many universities around the world. Right, so that's has to do with what kind of demands you put, but you can get direct results through civil disobedience, through direct action, in a way that you would never do with other kinds of protest, and which you can achieve with quite small numbers of people. Of course, also that goes for media attention as well. You can get much more space in the media with much smaller numbers of people when you do disobedient protests. And in a way, that's what appeals to me with disobedient protest, and why I'm so interested in it, because I can see that it has shaped quite a lot of political life and political discussion around a number of issues, with much smaller amounts of people than have been involved in other kinds of protest. So then, to kind of, obviously I've touched on this, but what makes it work? Well, having achievable demands works, right? If you have demands that the actors that you are protesting against can do something about, can put into place, then you are much more likely to achieve something. So achievable demands, but and that's not to say that we shouldn't aim big. Of course we should, but then that's you're not going to necessarily get each protest won't have the same results. And what we also have to remember is that these protests come at great personal risk to the people who carry them out. Target. So, who are we targeting with our protest? So, if we target the general public, what's the reason for doing that? And what do we? That's the only reason for targeting the general public, I think, would be to achieve space in the media. So then, you have to really make sure that you use that in the right way. So Extinction Rebellion, for example, have now said that they will no longer target the general public, right? So that was part of their kind of, when they declared that we quit at the start of this year, wasn't actually we quit. It was more of a, well, we're no longer going to target the general public. We're going to just have target specific emitters, or the government, and so on. So obviously, if you have a target, then you need to do much less if you have a logical target, then you need to do much less to justify your protests. But you also might not get the same attention. So Just Stop Oil, for example, was founded or started off with attacking sort of the oil infrastructure. But that's often, located far away from where the journalists hang out and far away from where there are a lot of people. So nobody really noticed, nobody took much notice of them. So although the target was much more logical from a stopping climate change perspective, they didn't achieve the same, and that's why they kind of then reverted to do more kind of headline grabbing kind of actions. So whilst it's easier to justify, you might lose the attention that you get otherwise. But more than that, what makes it work? Well, what does the actions that these groups take, what do they say about the politics? What do the targets say about the politics of these groups? And there, so what we've seen a lot in the UK has been, targeting of banks and so on. So how clear does that kind of messaging becomes of like, what's the role of the sort of banking sector, for example, in that. So, and when we see Just Stop Oil in their most recent kind of wave was of protests, also targeted, for example, luxury car dealerships and so on. And there you can see, so although and as a critical political economist, I've often been frustrated with these. Or I was frustrated with Extinction Rebellion in early days, and being kind of not wanting to talk about capitalism or whatever that kind of means, because they didn't want to be labeled as a kind of left-wing group. They wanted to have a kind of wider appeal. But more and more in the targets that these groups have chosen, it's clear that they take their aim at the way that the political economy works, right? So then that can be both kind of culturally through, markers like, luxury cars as a kind of marker of class and of a culture of, high emission kind of culture. Or, as we say, against banks and obviously, of course, the fossil fuel industry themselves. So there we have seen, I think, a shift to targeting much more of the forces that drive capitalism as it is, I suppose. Now, where my kind of main critiques against these movements have gone is what I kind of see as Hallemism, named after the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam. And it is this focus on arrest, and this kind of, I suppose, glorifying arrest. Because whilst getting arrested is always a risk if you engage in activities that break the law, making the arrest an aim in itself is something that comes at a really high cost for activists. And it's also something that doesn't necessarily, when they launched Extinction Rebellion and so on, they made a whole lot of claims about, what we're doing is based on social science. And this is also a thing that they go on, like they say now with Just Stop Oil, for example, which Hallam is also very deeply involved in. And, civil disobedience is going to save us, it's our only hope. Now, I don't think it is. I think that civil disobedience is really important, and it's something that is absolutely justifiable. But putting all our hope to it, I think, is also a mistake to some extent. But particularly this thing with getting arrested is basically based on one episode of this US civil rights movement. And he basically read something in a book and then said, well, this is what we have to do. And it's taken it completely out of the context in which it was in which it was carried out. So this kind of over focus and glorification of getting arrested is something that I think wasn't very well thought through, and that also had some unfortunate political consequences in the way that it often excludes many people from engaging in the movement. What we've also seen, and this is obviously not Roger Hallam's or anybody else's fault as such, but we've obviously seen a big authoritarian backlash, and that's partly because these movements have achieved a lot. So we've got anti-protest laws in country after country, which is also something that I've started to research more and more. But that's really changed the context under which these protests take place. So the scope is smaller in a way. Another question that has been that raised around this is violence. So Roger Hallam is a very non-violent, so very much professing non-violence. That's obviously something that has been more questioned, and is also something that I often discuss with my students. What is violence actually? Can you be violent against things, for example? Is sabotage of objects a violent act? It's certainly classified as such by our governments, but is it so ethically? And that's obviously something that is also increasingly questioned and played with. I mean, this How to Blow Up a Pipeline new film coming out, I've seen, or I've seen trailers for. It's probably already out. And obviously also one thing that Hallam and this kind of Hallamism has been critiqued for is that it hasn't been very good at building movements, building broader movements. So it's not really it doesn't really have a political vision, and they have seen that as a good thing, as in like we can pull in more people if we don't have a very clear political vision. But it can also, I think, be limiting, and it has, and obviously they are doing very risky things, and that also has not been, that makes it difficult to draw in large numbers of people. So I'm not convinced that it has done very much to build a kind of broader climate movement. Now, they will say that that's because we are part of a radical flank to a more kind of moderate flank in the broader climate movement. And now you can see how it can do like that, because they kind of open up spaces for conversation. And in that case, I kind of buy into that it certainly has done that. But in terms of I'm not sure I would call them radical, because although their actions are risky, the lack of political vision within it, really kind of ideology or whatever you want to call it, makes it maybe not all that radical, right? Like, I mean, as in it's difficult to, they're not, although they're radical in their actions, they're not necessarily radical in what they envision for the world. I'm going to skip that slide because I want to go ahead to the questions. But largely, I suppose, if I would speak to a group of activists, I would say, and I recently came out with a co-authored paper that questions this. What do climate activists mean when they say system change, not climate change? Whose system, what change? And when I asked, this question, who and what stands in the way for action on climate change, I had a kind of session with a student activist about this a few weeks ago during strikes here. And what comes out then is also, some kind of version of wealth capitalism, or how the economy works, actually property rights, and who has the right to do what with what kind of property, profit motive, the need for growth are things that stand in the way for action on climate change. If those are kind of structural reasons, then you have certain agents, private actors, certain sectors, obviously not least the fossil fuel industry, but also other industries, such as the financial industry, that might stand in the way, certain state actors that stand in the way, and also this kind of broader culture of kind of consumerist culture and a political culture that limits us. This came through from students as well. A political culture that limits our vision of what is possible in a way. So what I would, I don't like telling people what the right thing to do is, but I do like to ask people to think why they're doing what they're doing. So after setting out these things that are wrong, when and how do what we do as activists, when does that weaken the structures and actors that we have set out here, or that I set out together with that group of kind of student activists? When do what we do weaken the power of those structures and actors? Because that's really what we need to do, and not presume that attention in itself is going to win the fight for us. I think I'll stop there and open up for questions, which will be moderated by Laura, I believe.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Berglund. That was extremely edifying. And I would just like to thank you for doing what we do in public health, which is having an evidence base for everything. At least we try. And so being so thoughtful and turning this topic into an area of scholarly work, I think is extremely helpful. We've got a lot of excitement here. So I'm going to jump right in. We had a question come in on the chat. Let me open this one up. This came in from Elon Martin Prashad. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. We're grateful to have you here from Quebec, Canada. Elon is a high school student, And we're especially grateful to have youth here because obviously there's a lot that is affecting all of us, but particularly younger generations. The question is, to what extent can indirect civil disobedience effectively tackle climate change when direct civil disobedience is impossible?
So there are a few different definitions about what indirect and direct civil disobedience is. So Rawls's definition of what direct civil disobedience is to directly break the law that you're protesting against. So I'm going to presume that it's something along those lines. Correct me if I'm wrong. But that's kind of like, if it's, so some kinds of direct disobedience are possible. And we often see those as the more successful civil disobedience campaigns. And they tend to be anti-extractivist struggles. So we can see them in a lot of places in the world. You have examples, from the US with the, North Dakota Access Pipeline, for example, that went global in its reach. And you have many anti-extractivist struggles across, Latin America that I'm familiar with. My dad's and different family members have been really involved in many of those. In the UK, for example, fracking was stopped. Like fracking is not practiced in the UK. It was stopped, and largely by anti-fracking activists that stopped fracking at site. So you can see that as kind of direct action, like we're stopping what it is. And yeah, the kind of, why indirect mean we're sitting on a road on a road outside London in order to stop, in order to get the government to put loads of money into insulating homes. That is a less direct action. So what they actually achieved, for example, was to really politicize the issue of home insulation, which for the UK is a really big deal if we're going to get anywhere near to reach the kind of emission targets that we have, because there's a lot of leakage of heat from British homes, right? It's a really old kind of housing stock, and it's a big problem. So insulating homes in Britain is a big deal. And they did insulate. They did get home insulation to become a much bigger political issue than it was. So my colleague here at the University of Bristol, Colin Davis, who I work, he's a clinical psychologist, but he works a lot on cognitive psychology professor, but he works a lot on these issues of climate protests as well, more on the getting arrested end of it than I have myself. But he did research about how home insulation, and tracked it in the media, and saw that, well, actually home insulation is being talked about much more. It went like this, and not just related to the protests themselves, but in general following the protests. So there is obviously stuff we can do that we can achieve. Now the bigger political things of are we actually saving the world? I mean, that's really difficult to find evidence for, right? But the kind of things that are that we can measure are things like, okay, so what kind of media attention are we getting with the things we're doing with these indirect forms of protest? And obviously, if homes are eventually insulated, the direct action will be one part of what achieved that, and actually it's part of a much broader, many broader political processes. But yeah.
Oh, sorry. That was excellent. Thank you. David Hughes.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm calling in here from Rutgers University in New Jersey. I have a question about accepting the legal consequences. You suggested that was a necessary component in civil disobedience, or in nonviolent direct action. Well, it actually was the civil disobedience part. So I wonder, I mean, I heard recently that some XR people in Britain were found not guilty in a trial through jury nullification. And I'm studying, in fact, some civil disobedience movements in New England, which are, again, have gone to trial hoping for jury nullification. Also, various activists have tried to use the necessity defense, which is another way of avoiding jail time and fines. And of course, if one can get away with it, then the number of people able to do civil disobedience will grow very substantially. So I guess my question is, I mean, what do you think of the jury nullification route in the UK and the US? And is bearing the legal consequences that necessary?
Before, could you just specify what jury nullification is?
Oh, that's where a jury believes, a juror or jury believes that the defendant did the crime, but they decide to set the law aside.
Yeah,
it is a power, but not a right that jurors in both countries have.
Yeah, absolutely. So the US and the UK are interesting cases here because we have trial by jury in both these countries. In Sweden, where I'm from, we don't have trial by jury, so that doesn't become an option. So in the UK, it's been a tactic by some activists to get a jury to produce as much damage that it would warrant, that it would kind of qualify to be tried by a jury, and very, very often we are found not guilty. The necessity, claiming that you've had a necessity to do what you need, that hasn't tended to be that successful in the UK. It's got a very poor success rate. So as a defense, I know this because my colleague Graham Hayes, who follows more the trials of these things than I do myself, has made that observation. I'm not sure how the necessity defense in the UK, in the US, if it's been successful or not. But what I would say about all of these is that at the same time, so we do have juries and courtrooms can be arenas to carry out this activism as well, and it's obviously something that activists have learned more. Like to start with, didn't really Extinction Rebellion weren't very good at using the courtroom as a space to get the message out. I suppose it was more about trying to get acquitted. It really depends here on the judge and so on. And obviously what we must also take into account here is that there's real efforts by states and by government, certainly in the UK, and I know that many states in the US also, to limit our right to protest, and that makes jury nullification in a way harder. So there was a very publicized case here in the UK where one of the defendants was sent to prison because he was prohibited by the judge to mention climate change in his trial, and he opposed that, right? And he mentioned climate change and was sent to prison on that basis for I don't know how many months, as a contempt of court. So I don't know if it answers your question, but the necessity defense hasn't been successful in the UK, but there has been plenty of nullifications by jury, and and also finding not guilty as well, and also but that is becoming harder, and that's a background. When the police crime sentencing in court bill came through in the UK, which was anti-protest bill, that I organized a letter signed by over 400 climate-related academics around the world to protest the criminalization of protesters, and I think that's a real battleground. And the UN Secretary General has said as much as well, and it's something that I think that more and more of us need to really turn our attention to and protest. And here in the UK, we hope that that kind of criminalization will stop, will be halted when we get a new government, which we no doubt will do pretty soon. But I'm not sure. The trend of criminalizing climate protesters and making it harder to get away and be let off by juries is a global trend.
Thank you so much. We have a question that came in from Jack Markowitz, which is, you've used the terms protest, civil disobedience, disobedience movement. What, if any, are the differences between these different forms of action? So protest, civil disobedience, and disobedience/movement.
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, protest is, anything that you protest. So if you stand outside somewhere with a placard, you are protesting something, right? And I think a lot of this kind of wave of climate activism has obviously been kind of going beyond that kind of protest to be more disruptive. So I often talk about disruptive protest, and civil disobedience is really one way of understanding this that comes from this kind of liberal tradition of thinking about political theory, and whereas I also set out the kind of anarchists who think more about it in terms of direct action. That's what the kind of terminology that they prefer. So really, civil disobedience and direct action become have a certain ideological or theoretical political baggage with them when we use those terms. Which I try to use disruptive protest as a descriptor of a protest that goes beyond just expressing your opinion and more about actually annoying somebody or something and stopping something.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you. And good question. And from Dr. DeBroat, the director of the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health, who we're so grateful is supporting this seminar series. My anecdotal observation is that the climate change disobedience direct action movement in the US is attracting increasing participation by people of color, especially when climate change is linked to issues like housing or criminal justice, for example. Do you see any potential for a mass climate change civil disobedience direct action movement similar to the US civil rights movement in the 1960s?
I hope so. I mean, I think it has to be. I often say, and I think I ended my last paper with that the struggle for climate justice does not necessarily start with climate, right? That this is that it needs to become a much broader movement. And although I think that there was a tendency when these movements first came in the UK with Extinction Rebellion that to depoliticize it, but actually we don't need to depoliticize it. We need to politicize it, right? We need to climate change is deeply political, and we know that, of course, you will know as well as I do that that climate change is the greatest kind of injustice and how it hits people, and it along class and race racist kind of lines in the US itself, and of course globally even more so, and it's absolutely essential, I think, to link it to these other issues. Now, the extent to whether that's happening, you will probably see better in the US to the extent to which that's happening. I mean, obviously, the environmental justice movement is a kind of inherently kind of anti-racist a movement in the US that has foundations in the US, and that's kind of given rise to climate justice as well. And I think it's significant that climate justice was not a demand of Extinction Rebellion in the UK, but it became a demand of Extinction Rebellion in the US. So I think that there is in the US climate movement, but this is my impression from kind of afar, that those kind of climate justice issues, which are much more politicized, have a stronger root in the climate change movement in the US than they do on this side of the Atlantic. That it's more white and middle class in Europe than it is in the US. That's certainly the impression you get from seeing it from afar. But you will know better.
Thank you. A question from Chris in Berlin. What are the CD tactics in the UK that have had the most impact? So what are the civil disobedience tactics that have been most effective?
Yeah, well, that I would say most effective to what? I mean, obviously, in a way, this kind of wave will started with the not that Extinction Rebellion's first thing was in April 2019, but their first, when they kind of became famous in April 2019, was achieved a public opinion shift. More people were concerned about climate change than previously. Fewer people denied its existence. More people saw it as a priority, as a political priority. So that we can see that in the kind of data that it was a shift happening at that time. But it is often, with many kinds of protests, it's a surprise element, that the novelty element that creates that. So then when you try to recreate it, well, then it doesn't have the same effect, right? So, a few months later, then it didn't really achieve anything at all. I mean, the Insulate Britain protests did achieve this kind of politicization of the insulation question, did push it, higher up the agenda, but that's just sitting in a road. At other times, sitting in a road achieves very little. So it's actually really difficult to say what particular tactics are the most that are the most kind of successful in a way. As I said, with any kind of civil disobedience is or direct action, the more local your target is, the greater will your chances be of getting a direct effect, a direct result from your actions.
Thank you. I would also wonder what the role is for the simplicity of the objective, right? And the fact that people are advocating on behalf of all of us, indeed all species, all of life, as opposed to a specific group. There's a certain sensibility. Asking for insulation is so so sensible. We have a question from, and I'm sorry, Mary Evelyn Tucker, I'm a huge fan of yours. I would love to get to your question, but we're just out of time. We have room for one more question. Samuel Gold, great question as well. Given the authoritarian backlash, can civil disobedience remain as effective means of protest in the long term, or does it become too unsafe and too unacceptable, as it already is for many, for people to perform acts of civil disobedience?
So, I mean, we know that being a climate activist or, an environmental activist is one of the most dangerous things you can do in many countries in the world. You have, Global Witness is an organization whose material I've used a lot to show how dangerous it is. That and being a trade unionist with, people get killed. It's never safe. It's never been safe. In a way, if you make more and more things illegal, then, more people will be doing illegal things, because more things are illegal to do, more types of protest. The fact is that who you are and where you are and what will affect the risks that you run of doing things. We're often protected not by the law itself, but by how the police can't, for example, some of the anti-protest laws that come in are absolutely inconceivable to think that the police will actually act consistently on those anti-protest law. They will deploy them as and when they see fit, and when they think it's important, and when they think they can get away with it. Yes, we will see civil disobedience and disobedience, and we will probably, a decade down the line, we will also see more violent, more sabotage and so on, I'm sure. So you can't, climate change is going to cause, a lot of disruption in itself within our lifetime, and people are going to take to desperate measures to do something about it. So I definitely think that we will see all kinds of protest, and that can't be legislated away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Berglund. You bring a lot of intellectual and activist power when you're discussing these things in such a thoughtful way. So we can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with us all today.
Thank you. It's been a great honor, and so many names that I see and respect hugely in in the audience as well. So thank you so much. Really good questions and really good discussions. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right.
Thanks, Oscar.